Welcome to the ClassCast podcast, where philosophy, policy, pedagogy, and people come together in honest, purposeful conversations about improving school and education for our students and our communities. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens, an award-winning English teacher, speaker, tutor, and podcast host in Northern Virginia. You can listen and subscribe to the ClassCast podcast on all major streaming services, on YouTube, and at classcastpodcast.com. Ladies and gentlemen, class is in session. Welcome to the ClassCast podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, I'll be speaking for just a few minutes about some sort of ongoing issues in public schools, in school boards, in the news. It's kind of everywhere. And so, where I work, Loudoun County, Virginia, has been a hotbed of just mayhem lately, right? We have people shouting down school board members. We have recall efforts. We have school board members resigning. There's just been so much turmoil, and it's all so very confusing because there's so many different issues at play here. We have people who have concerns about their personal morals and religious ideologies. We have concerns about updating curriculum and improving the texts we choose and the ways we teach and being culturally responsive, which to some people sounds fantastic and to other people somehow sounds like racism. And it's just, pardon my language, it's all bullshit, right? Like, this is just a mess. And so I thought that maybe we could talk about this for a few minutes and look at how a variety of different decisions, both from school administrators and school board members and politicians or political operatives, as well as just individual citizens, parents, students, etc., how all of these people are sort of making choices that ultimately lead to some of this sort of backlash. Whether you're for the changes going on in schools or you're against them, whether you're for critical race theory or against it, or you're for teaching the classics or against it, it doesn't matter, right? This whole thing's a mess. And so what I'd like to point at is sort of the general trend in recent years of standardization across classrooms. Okay. I think we every 20, 30 years you get this push for standardized testing, and then after a while people get tested out. We see the problems, the downfalls of those plans, and the testing gets dialed back. And then 20 years, 30 years later, it comes back again. Standardized testing was big in the 50s and 60s. It fades for a while. It comes back in the late 90s and roars to the forefront of education with the No Child Left Behind Act in the early 2000s. And, it's 2021. I think we're reaching the point where people are recognizing, okay, maybe we've overdone it a little bit. And so, in Virginia, where I live and work, but in a bunch of places around the country, you're seeing a reduction in the number of standardized tests, which I personally think is probably good. I think that we should keep some of the tests. It's important to have some benchmark data. It's important to see, are students being served well? Are the teachers in a given school or department, sort of doing their job? But we could probably do it with fewer tests, right? Interestingly, though, as we are moving away from that standardized testing, we're seeing this sort of, as the testing's coming down, simultaneously, you're sort of seeing the increased level of what we might call project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, where students are supposed to not just do a project to demonstrate what they know or what they've learned, but to do the project as the method of learning. I starting probably somewhere around when I was in college. I graduated undergrad in 2005. And I remember, people already making the point that you don't want to lecture too much. Direct instruction is important, but don't overdo it. And within 5 or 6 years after that, I'm hearing, basically don't do little or no direct instruction. I remember sitting through a professional development, and I was probably 6 or 7 years into my career, and the trainer basically said, direct instruction doesn't work, can't work, stop doing it. As though no school in the history of mankind has ever worked, because it's been almost all direct instruction, right? Now, sure, there are apprenticeships and things where people learn hands-on, but most of what we think of as school for most of human history has been direct instruction. And are we just saying none of this works? Like, that's insane. And I remember walking out of the meeting thinking like, well, they had some good ideas about some other stuff, but maybe they need to lighten up on direct instruction. Like, sure, you shouldn't be lecturing for 90 minutes a block, every day. It's not the only thing you should do, but it can work, right? Especially if you're charismatic about it, if you know your content well. And I actually had two people stop me on the way out and mention me and two other teachers in the building. They said, when he says that, it made sense, but I just thought about how many of my students have mentioned you and so and so and so and so. These two other teachers said that they love some of the lectures in your classes. And I'm like, well, I'm flattered. Also, to be fair, I'm not lecturing for 90 minutes straight. It's a back and forth. I'm talking with the students and all the rest. And the one woman said, I understand that, but it's just, they're making that push towards students sort of doing all the learning on their own, and we're going to be sort of facilitators. She's like, I just thought I'd mention that, you have students who like what you're doing. Well, hey, that's great. It makes me feel good. But it was one of those times in my career that really solidified the idea that we can't be extreme in our pedagogy. And there's a paper that was published, I don't even know when, to be honest, some at least in the second half of the 1900s. I think it's actually more recent than that. But there was a researcher, an author, and I'm blanking on her name, I apologize, but she wrote a paper, and part of the title had something to do with, I'll never forget this phrase, the fetishization of pedagogy. And I didn't even have to, I went back and read, most of the paper. I'm not sure if I finished it, but I read most of the research. But the title itself did it for me. And like, boom, I thought back to that moment where I had someone stop me after that meeting and say, hey, some of the kids like your lectures enough that they actually mentioned in another class. I thought, okay, cool. That's a good thing. But it's, again, you shouldn't lecture like that every day. You shouldn't only do project-based learning. You shouldn't rely on standardized tests for all the data you need to know who's learning and who isn't, right? And so I think what happens is that sometimes we sort of fetishize these ideas. We get so wrapped up that this is the right way, that there's one ideological way to do this, that's what's going to work. That's insane, right? I mean, most educational researchers and writers and professional developers and trainers and all these people are very quick to acknowledge, especially recently, are very quick to acknowledge there are a lot of different ways that students learn. That different students learn in different ways. They have different interests, and we need to provide different ways for them to access the curriculum. And that person will tell you that, and then they'll just as quickly turn around and say, "But don't ever do blank, because that's not going to work." Well, but maybe it works for some people, right? And how do we know? Well, we need some data. So the testing might be important. We also need to have some variety. Okay. And so, somewhat ironically, as the standardized testing has sort of decreased in recent years, we're seeing a stronger and stronger push towards standardization of instruction. Okay. And some of this may be pushing towards, fully, sort of individualized learning, or some sort of like universal design for learning, where essentially every kid in the room is going to have an option that fits their needs and their desires. And the teacher is really, mostly just a facilitator. And hey, I mean, maybe that works. Maybe that'll be fine. But I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think that most teachers currently in the profession have been educated in that way. Like, not only as students, but as teachers, most of us have not been taught how to teach that way, nor have we gone to school and experienced it. And so, if that's the goal, that's a sea change, right? And you have to be preparing people from a young age for it. That's a difficult thing to ask. And it's also something that, interestingly, I think a lot of parents would resist. I think that there are still many parents who say, no, I want a teacher who's knowledgeable, who's confident in their ability to teach. I want someone who's going to teach my kid, not just set them up with a series of modules or independent readings and videos to watch and say, go figure it out yourself. There are people who still appreciate sort of the more traditional forms and classical forms of education. I don't know if that's most people or just some, but I guarantee you they're out there. I've talked to some of these people, right? And so what we have is sort of this weird sort of shift in the sort of ideas of teaching. And so, our idea of what is a good teacher is changing pretty rapidly for some people. If I say, what's a good teacher, think how many people are going to say, oh, someone who connects with their students, someone who has a good relationship with their students. Yeah, hey, that's absolutely true. But I don't know if that's the first thing that should come out of your mouth, because someone who has a good relationship with their students but doesn't know jack about what they're teaching, that just sounds like a buddy. That doesn't sound like a teacher. Now, can you be great with your content, terrible with the students, and still be a good teacher? Probably not, especially not with younger. I mean, the older you get, yeah, anyone who's been to college knows that you have professors who are perfect. They're experts in what they're talking about. They know everything. and they're jerks, they don't get along with their students, but you can still learn in those classes. But I think that requires a little bit of, self motivation and, a certain degree of maturity and all that. So that gets easier with age. But again, as we say, what is a good teacher? Well, what is a good class? And I think that what's happening is, with or without the standardized tests, we're seeing more and more school administrators. And in some parts, this is principals, but I think a lot of this gets into like superintendent, assistant superintendent levels. These are the people who are like head of content areas. You're the supervisor for math instruction, or, you're this, the people in those roles, right? They've worked very hard and, generally speaking, have built, strong careers, great resumes, to get to that spot where they get to call the shots and say, hey, this is the way we're going to teach it. This is what the curriculum is going to look like. We're going to revise it. We're going to work on this draft. We're going to try to get the school board to pass and say, yeah, this is what we do now. And I wouldn't begrudge someone who's willing to work so hard through their own education and career to get to that level. However, I wouldn't automatically give that person the full right to say, this is how every person is going to teach in every classroom for every kid. Because I think the reality is, we have to remember that teachers are people, and as people, we have certain strengths and weaknesses. And so it's natural for a teacher to play to his or her own strengths, and to try to minimize or avoid some of the things you're weaker on. I don't think that that's a bad thing. Now, we should, of course, reduce our weaknesses and make sure that we're learning and improving on them. But you're always going to have something that you're better at. And so it's reasonable to say, well, if I'm really good at blank, so I'm really good with teaching rhetoric and persuasive communications, it makes sense you would do more of that. Why? Because you can have a bigger impact, right? You give the kid more of what you're best at, because they're going to get the best possible, content and skills related to that strength. So when we start to standardize, or maybe I'll use the word centralize some of the decision making, we get into some weird places, right? A lot of teachers start to feel disenfranchised. I talked about this a little bit in episode, what was it? I talked about don't dummy proof teaching. This is just a couple months ago, episode 73. In episode 73, I talked about don't dummy proof teaching. And one of the reasons that we're centralizing the decision-making processes, and that we're standardizing the ways to teach, not just what to teach. I mean, that's been standardized in certain ways for a while, but how to teach it, what book lists do we use, or how much time do we spend on each time period in a history class, et cetera. A lot of that is essentially dummy proofing. And I think it's I don't know, it's the chicken and the egg, right? It's a paradox of, do we need to dummy proof the classroom? Do we need to make everything so strict and rigid and planned out because the teachers aren't good enough to figure it out on their own? Or is it that we made that decision, and as a result, a lot of your most intelligent, most capable, most creative teachers no longer want to be in the field? Like, how do you keep, attract and retain your best and brightest if you basically give them a job where most of the thinking's been taken out of it, right? Oh, here's your curriculum. Here's your book. Here's your list. Here's your curriculum. Do it this way. Have the kids go do these projects, and you provide some guidance here and there. I'm not saying it can't work. I'm just saying that doesn't sound like a job that's really attractive to someone who enjoys thinking and wants to do all this, right? And so we have this real concern about why we're centralizing all these decisions. Now, part of this is going to vary, extensively by school division. I think on average, the smaller your district or division is, probably the more sort of freedom that you have, because no one's saying, well, we have to guarantee, sort of quality assurance. In where I work, I think we're up to 17 or 18 high schools, and that's been, we essentially open a new high school, and that's just high schools. We open a new high school probably every 2 years, every 2 or 3 years, because of a growing population. Well, there came a point where you got beyond the original, say, 4 or 5 schools, and people started saying, well, we have to make sure things are somewhat consistent school to school. What if a kid switches from one school to another in the middle of the year? Shouldn't we have something in place there to say, hey, you're not going to go into the new school and get stuck doing the same stuff you've already done, or, you're going to be doubling up on skills or missing things, et cetera. And which is interesting, because that's actually a big part of the argument for Common Core, for a nationwide curriculum, is that when students move from place to place, they shouldn't all of a sudden have a brand new, sort of curriculum to follow, or a pacing and course of program, or a program of studies. So, it's interesting just because I think a lot of people who resist the idea of Common Core, and thinking about superintendents and supervisors, a lot of the people who resist Common Core are also the people who support the idea of centralized decision making in their local school division. So, there's now a lot of people who are very worried about, well, we can't have a kid in this school having this kind of experience, reading these books, or, doing this kind of math, or doing these experiments in physics class. And then you go over to this other school and they're having this completely different experience. And, hey, look, if your job is to supervise and manage that large group of schools, I completely understand the desire to standardize it, to centralize the decision making process. How else can you keep track? And so if your job is to oversee all of this and coordinate it, how can I do it if wildly different things are happening? The problem I have with this is that school is not designed to make it easy to administer. Like, we shouldn't be doing what's easy for someone to supervise or oversee. We should be doing what works for the students. And what works for the students is going to be something that they're interested in and that has value and that their teacher believes in and can teach well. I've said this 1,000 times. If it's not authentic to the teacher, it's not going to be authentic to the student. If I don't believe in what I'm teaching, then I just kind of go through the motions. Even if I try hard, I fake it, right? At some point, it's going to slip that I don't really care about this, or I don't really like it. And for some kids, as soon as you realize the teacher doesn't think it's important, you know what? I don't think it's that important either. If this guy doesn't care about it and this is his job, why do I care about it? So we always have to fake like we're caring, but we have to be honest. And sometimes we don't. I have friends who teach history and they have time periods or cultures, countries, things that they like more, they like less. They have more to do with, they have less to do with. And I think that's natural, right? And so while we'd say, hey, but that's not ideal, that every teacher has a different set of strengths and weaknesses, and that every kid's going to get a slightly different experience. The reality is everybody's going to get a different experience anyway, right? We have different friends in our classes. We have different teachers where even if you can centralize the decision making on the curriculum, hey, we've got different personalities, right? We get along with different kids. You have different extracurriculars. You have different clubs from school to school. You can't control every piece of it. And the problem is that as we centralize that decision-making process, teachers feel disenfranchised. You feel like you've lost you've lost the power to make good decisions for what works for your students and for you in your classroom. And you have. I mean, it's not just the feeling, that's the reality. Someone else is making the calls. Where I work, we've had a large overhaul in curricula, over the last probably 10 years. I would say probably all or most of the subject areas have had a noticeable change in their curriculum. New textbook adoptions, new reading lists in English. There's been a lot of change in general. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but in every one of those changes, the range of acceptable discussion, or the freedom that a teacher has to vary their timeline or their chronology and things like that in the class has been dramatically reduced. And no one in charge is ever going to say that. They don't want to admit that. They'll say, oh, no, you still get to make all these choices. Look at all these choices. But I'm making choices off of a much smaller menu, right? So they say, hey, look, I'll just stick to English because that's what I teach. That's what I know best. They say, well, look, you can still choose from this list of 5 books for this unit. Yeah, but you told me I have to teach this topic. I have to have this essential question. We have to hit on this theme. And you gave me a list of 5 books. We used to do this where we just had a reserved reading list for the whole grade level. And you had like 30, 40 books on there. Pick whatever book you want, pick whatever theme you want, make it work, right? Have the kids read great stuff. Well, this leads to some problems again for the teachers. I'm going to get to the parents in just a second, but as the teacher, you say, okay, well, so now I get to choose from these 5 books. What's really interesting is I think in most parts of the country, we're seeing a push for more what we might think of as a high interest literature. You're seeing more and more young adult literature put into schools, more and more current stuff, things have been published in the last 10 years, 15 years, targeting young people, which I think in some ways is good. How are you going to become a good reader if you don't ever like to read, right? So high interest is good. The problem is that a lot of these reading lists have removed a lot of the things we might consider classics. They're things of immense cultural value. We might, all of a sudden, Hemingway's mostly gone. Shakespeare is there, but reduced. How much Oscar Wilde their kid's going to read. And, hey, it's tricky language, but it's hilarious and was very edgy for its time. Some of it's still edgy now. And kids don't get that familiarity with it, right? A lot of the classic, Greek and Latin texts are gone. And they've been replaced by things that we think are very interesting to students. Well, cool. Maybe that's good. But guess what? As a teacher, I didn't jump into this job to teach, to use books and to teach concepts using, young adult fiction, where I got to replace the book every 3 years to find something that's more current and applies to these kids. I also don't have any education in that. Why do I need an English degree? Why do I need to be an expert in all the classics and the great works from the United States? You take a Brit Lit class, you can take a German Lit class. I took African literature class and Middle Eastern poetry class and all this stuff, right? Like I took these classes so that I knew all this stuff. And now I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, I'm going to teach you, from some random book that was published 3 years ago that, may have some literary merit, but let's be honest, a lot of the young adult fiction and the current stuff that's being pushed, no one's going to be talking about it in 50 years. It doesn't have the staying power. Now, I'm not making an argument that all we have to do or all we should do is teach the old stuff. I'm just saying that we shouldn't necessarily throw away some great classic works either, just because it's hard to read. Well, good. It's supposed to be hard. The school's supposed to be hard. You go to learn, right? And learning is hard. you need to sort of stretch those muscles a little bit and push up against your limits. And so I think we're seeing sort of this quiet sort of bubbling of a teacher backlash. And what I mean by that is, I think on average, most teachers just don't want to deal with it. And so they don't speak up too much. But I've talked to a lot of people who have concerns, say within English with some of these books, just because, not that they're not good books, but because they said, well, I don't know enough about it, right? I don't know enough about the book. I've never read this book before. This wasn't taught in a college class. This wasn't taught when I was in high school. And, I don't have time. I'm not paid enough to be reading all these books I'm not that into on my own time. And I don't have time in school. I don't have time to grade things and to plan lessons and to respond to emails and attend meetings and help students who need one-on-one help and do it all in my work hours. I probably average around 45 minutes to an hour of work outside of the school day every day. At certain points in the year, it's more, at certain points, it's a little lighter, but for a whole school year average, I probably average somewhere around an hour, maybe even more, maybe hour and a half a day, working outside of my contract hours. And that doesn't include much reading. So now, like, I'm going to read all these new books just so I can turn around and teach them in a unit that someone else set up to do all this stuff. Man, I tell you, that is a defeating feeling. You say, okay, well, what if it's all planned out for you? You're ready to go. You only have to have a minimum knowledge of the text. Well, isn't the teacher supposed to be the expert in the room, right? And so I think we have to be really careful with what we choose. I mean, I know people who have been on, curriculum development committees and who work on, the new book lists and new units and things like that in a variety of different school systems, where they've not even hinted, where people have been directly told, and this is in multiple school systems, we're going to put together these new reading lists. We're going to put together the choice list, the books that students or the teacher can choose to use in a given unit. But let's make sure that we're not going with the classic dead straight white guys, straight up, like as a quote. And this is not in one school system. There's a lot of, let's stay away from the dead straight white guys. And so I've seen directions where you literally have to pick books where either the author or the protagonist has to be female, a person of color, or LGBTQ. That's it. You can't have a book that was written by a white dude in which the main character is a white dude. I'm not saying the whole curriculum should be that way. Like, we want variety, right? We want to teach a lot of different authors, and we want different protagonists and different plot lines, and we want variety. But where are we at when we specifically say the number one thing? Like, it's not, we want things of high literary merit. Like, yes, we want that too, but where the number one priority is, let's look at what quote unquote kind of person wrote the book, or quote unquote what kind of person is the main character. I don't know that that should be the dominant part of the discussion. And that's happening. That's happening in a lot of places. Now, I think that culturally responsive education is good. If you have a diverse student body, you should be understanding the different cultural experiences and personal experiences of those students and embracing that and finding ways to connect with those experiences and elaborate on them in your class, as that fits your content area. But I think we need to be mindful of the fact that you can take that same idea a little bit too far. And what happens is you end up with a lot of people who say, well, I don't feel empowered to teach books that I know or that I like, or history teachers saying, I don't feel empowered to focus in on time periods or events that, are of significant importance to me. And so some of you listening right now are like, yeah, fine, because some people shouldn't be trusted with those decisions, right? There are some history teachers who will only teach, they'll spend half the year on the Civil War, and they're going to, whatever your bias is, for or against the Confederacy, they're going to teach it the wrong way. You're going to have, biology teachers who spend way too much time, quote unquote, on evolution, and they're not going to spend enough on something else. Like, we all have our preferences, right? And that's part of the issue here that makes this so complex. Parents might have certain things they want their kid to learn more or less of, but how do they get to choose that? Right? Even saying, oh, I'm going to send my kid to a private school. In a private school, you actually get even less influence over the curriculum because you chose to go to the school. So you go in and say, oh, I don't want my kid to read this book. They'd be like, all right, we'll pull your kid out of the school, right? In public school, we have to flex a little bit. We have to adapt to that. But we really got to be careful, because when one teacher makes a decision about how they're going to teach a time period in history class, or how they're going to teach a difficult or controversial subject in, a health class, or in an English class, or, whatever. When the teacher makes a decision that the parents question, the parents contact the teacher, or they contact the principal, or both. And then you have this group of people who are locally invested in that individual student's experience. The parents have a concern about, let's say it's a book in English class, right? The parents have the concern about this book. They contact the teacher. The teacher can say, here's why I've chosen the book. Here's how it fits. Here's what we're doing. If the parents don't like it, they don't like the answer, they go to the principal. That we have a meeting. Maybe we switch the book. Maybe we don't. Right. But we all understand the situation. We can meet each other. We're regular people. We understand we're all trying to do the best we can to support this young person in their learning. But when the teacher isn't the person who made that decision, when that decision is made high up in the ranks of superintendents, assistant superintendents, content area supervisors, then when the person complains to the teacher goes, well, that's just what I'm supposed to teach. That's a terrible defense. When the number one reason we're using a particular book or a textbook, or, we're focusing on a concept in class, is because, I don't know, someone else told me to do it. That's not a defense of it. That's passing the buck. But you have to pass the buck because you didn't make the decision. I can't stand here and defend someone else's choice to implement curriculum that I hadn't, limited say in or no say in. It's really tricky, right? So where does the complaint go? Well, it goes to the teacher, and then it goes to the principal. But because the principal didn't really do that either, all of a sudden we're having these discussions at higher and higher levels. And so when either the school board voted on the change in a curriculum or a book list, or, whatever that may be, say an equity training for the teachers, that's been a hot button issue, right? When the school board votes and says, hey, we're all going to run through this equity training, if a parent or someone in the community has concerns about it, they can't go straight to the principal or go to, they can't go into the school that their kids attend and say, hey, I would like to change this, or I'm not comfortable with it. They have to go to the school board. And so what happens is, as more and more people have concerns, either I want more young adult literature, I want more LGBTQ, characters, or I want more, whatever the issue of the moment is, right? There's people who are saying, I want more of it. There's people who say, I want less of it. And instead of them having sort of a calm, reasonable discussion with the classroom teacher, with the principal, they end up at the school board meeting. And you end up the school board meeting because you centralize the decision making. So now, instead of having a quiet civil conversation with your student's teacher and principal, you're having this big, loud discussion in a school board meeting with this group of people who don't know your kid, Now they probably, they're school board members, they probably care about your kid, but they don't know your kid by name. They have no idea what that person, what that student's interests are, abilities are, what their needs are. They just said, hey, we believe in this philosophy, or we believe in this approach, this curriculum, this book list, whatever it may be. And as people congregate in that school board room, they realize other people share their concerns. And it's not just people at their kids' school, it's people at all of the different schools in your division or district. So now you've got buddies. Now I meet these people. Well, they're worried about their kids the same way I'm worried about mine. So now I've got backup, right? Hey, we're here together. Now the people in this room who sort of have a face and a name that I recognize, the people that I feel like I identify with, are the people who hold the same concern I have, which in some cases could be mild, but usually we don't show up to school board meetings to speak strongly on mild concerns. Usually we're there because we're pretty fired up about something, or we have a major concern. Okay, so where do you go? Well, now I've got to speak up. Now all these people are going to speak up. And the more people on my side who speak up, the more confident I feel, the more emboldened I feel. Well, now what happens with people who disagree? Well, now they're going to speak up, and it becomes this like shouting match. And all the while, the school board's sitting there getting yelled at from all different directions. And they're saying, well, hey, I mean, I'm in this position because I wanted to help the community. I wanted to improve the quality of schools. And people are saying, you hate children, you can't be trusted, whatever else. Look, we don't have to agree, but how many people are going to walk into a teacher's classroom and say, oh, you, my kid's teacher, I think you hate kids and you want them to be in danger? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. Who walks into, the fifth grade teacher's classroom and say, yeah, I think you're intentionally going to hand my kid pornographic readings, or you're going to brainwash my kid to be more or less racist, or whatever, right? It's not saying no one would ever say it. I'm just saying that seems really like a strange thing to do. You'd probably walk in with some questions first, then some suggestions, or, hey, what can we do for my kid? But when the decision isn't made by the classroom teacher, when more and more curriculum and content and reading lists, et cetera, are being decided at higher levels of administration and at the school board, then what happens is everybody goes there. And so as you centralize the decision-making, you are also centralizing the complaint process. Now, what used to be an email to the teacher or principal is a public statement in front of a school board. Now the press covers it. Now it's online. Now we're reading quotes in the papers. All of a sudden, what started off as just, hey, I don't want my kid to read this one book, turns into, dozens, scores, in some cases, hundreds of parents rallying, marching, holding signs, protesting, screaming, all for what? I don't want my kid to read a certain book. Just don't have your kid read it. It's public school. You can almost always say, hey, I don't want my kid to read the book. Like, I mean, the rare exceptions are like AP classes where the kid chose it, and it's supposed to be a college level course where you're going to read challenging material anyway. I don't think I've ever had a parent challenge a book where I didn't offer a reasonable alternative, regardless of what my boss has said. I've had principals and department chairs say, you don't really have to do anything on this one. Like, you can just use the book. That's not a reasonable concern. And I still usually offer the parent, I think every time I offer the parent, why? I offer the alternate text because I want the parent to be happy with the class, because I want the kid to feel comfortable and like they're learning something. It's a lot easier for me, and probably for the kid too, if you just do what we're all doing in class together. But hey, I can flex, I can do this. But when it's not my curriculum, or I don't even say my curriculum, but when it's not my course plan, it's not my unit that I designed, it's not the question and topic that I was trying to get us to talk about, I can still offer you the text, but I don't feel like I have as much skin in the game. I don't care as much because somebody else told me I had to do it. Right. So when the parents get angry and say, well, how dare you say my kid has to read this book? What a lot of those parents don't realize is that there are teachers sitting around saying, well, hey, I didn't really want to pick that one either. But that's where we're at, right? So as quick as we want to say, well, we don't need to standardize all of the testing. We don't need all the standardized testing. We don't need a national curriculum. We now have local school divisions that are essentially instituting even more draconian policies on their own. And whether that's the wokest school in the country, where everything is anti-racist and fully inclusive and whatever, blah, 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 Or you go to the most conservative parts of the country where we're passing laws and saying you can't teach anything that looks like CRT. Oh, we're going to remove, X, Y, and Z civil rights heroes from the state tests. Just, well, hey, why on earth are we trusting a small group of people to make this massive decision for so many? You either really don't trust the classroom teachers themselves, the people who are the boots on the ground, right? The people who are actually working with the students, who are trying to make good decisions for what works for their students, what works for their goals, and what works for them in their classroom. And those people all of a sudden don't get to make the choice anymore. So when I have friends or, family members ask me, like, what do you think about all this critical race theory stuff? I'm like, I don't know, man. Let's be honest. In most cases, this isn't really happening. And you're going to find a handful of school divisions in the country where they're implementing something that might look kind of like it, sort of a dumbed down version of critical race theory. And people say, see, isn't that terrible? Well, I don't know. I'm not in the classroom. I haven't talked to the teacher. I don't know what the kids in the classroom look like. What kind of community are we in? Is this a really diverse community? Is this a all white rural place? Like being culturally responsive means responding to the culture of the students in the room and the local community. It means we can't make one decision that everybody has to read this one book nationwide. Like that's awful. And I'm saying this for everyone, for people who are saying, get rid of all this new young adult trash, just bring back the classics. That's not going to work for everybody either. Who's best equipped to make the decision? The teacher who's in the room with the kids every day, right? I know the kids in the room. I know how well or poorly they read. I know what they're interested in. I've watched what they were doing in class. What do they get excited about? What don't they get excited about? It's my job as a professional to react to those observations, give them more of the things that they're into, more of the things that are working, and challenge them. And if that means I need to do more young adult literature in one class, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to suck it up and I'm going to go read that book. Why? Because I think that's the best thing for these kids. And in some classes, I'm going to be like, you know what, guys, we're reading Charles Dickens and I hope you love it. Or maybe you'll hate it. And in some cases, it doesn't matter because school isn't 100% about just having fun. It's about getting good results. And getting good results means sometimes it's going to be hard. It means that sometimes you have to come in and hear things you don't like and you don't agree with. Nobody should have the intention of sending their kids to school so that they learn how to maintain the parents' worldview. It doesn't mean your worldview is bad. It doesn't mean that you want to send your kid to school to be indoctrinated in some other way of thinking. It means you go to school to learn the things that your parents could not teach you well. This is why homeschooling tends, on average, to work better in younger grades, and it gets harder as you get older. There are plenty of people who do homeschooling all the way through high school graduation, do a great job. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying it is much, much harder to teach a kid an AP European history class, an AP calculus class, an AP psych class, an AP bio class. To go through and do all of this stuff. One parent is almost never able and equipped with the kind of knowledge it takes to teach those things, let alone with the teaching skill it takes to get into those details. This is why people who do homeschool all the way through high school almost always end up buying curricula or swapping to where different parents will teach different things. It becomes sort of this group effort because it requires more and more specialization, right? You might be able to do this in the elementary levels, but as you get to the high school, you need someone who is an expert. Okay. And that means that someone who understands the content and understands the goals well enough that they can tailor it to meet the students in front of them. And so if you put me in a room with 25 kids and say, okay, teach them these skills, give me just the state standards, read and process, think critically about nonfiction, understand how to use standard punctuation marks, do a little research, good public speaking skills, figure out the list. And then I'll be honest, like leave it alone. Just give me the list, give me access to some decent texts, and I'll get it done. But when I'm given the list of skills and I'm given a narrow list of texts, many of which I'm not familiar with, and I know that the community is in an uproar because they, hate the new texts, or they love them and they hate the teachers who are resisting and trying to use the old stuff, whatever that situation is. When the community gets in an uproar and someone brings a complaint to me, what am I going to do as a reasonable teacher? I'm going to say, okay, well, I understand your complaint. Perhaps you should take it up with the people who made the decision. And so as we centralize the decision-making processes in schools, particularly surrounding the specific content, texts, time periods in history, things like that, which famous figures we do or don't teach, when all of that gets centralized and is made, the decisions made outside the classroom, we get into some tricky places where you have to consider, does the teacher really know and care about every piece of this? Are they going to teach it with full enthusiasm and authenticity? And are they then going to have the flexibility to adjust and adapt to the individual students in that room? Okay. The more we make these decisions at school board and superintendent supervisor levels, the less power and influence the classroom teacher has. And so when the community goes crazy and they love or hate or whatever it is, you know what? I'm not fielding too many of those complaints. Somebody else has to make the call, because you already made the call in the books that I'm going to have to teach. Right. So I think we need to be very, very careful with the sort of trend towards standardization, commonization between different classes. I mean, whether this is literal common planning, where all the teachers who teach the same class have to plan together and give the same assessments, to doing it in a county-wide or a district-wide sort of format. I understand it's easy to oversee that way. It gives a certain degree of quality assurance. However, I think that what you're doing is you're handcuffing your best teachers to the worst. And just like, most teachers do, you kind of teach to the middle a little bit. Well, when you're working on curriculum and things like this for teachers, you're going to think about the average teacher. Right. And in some cases, if you look at the materials and the guidelines are being handed, I think sometimes we're thinking about someone who's like a little bit below average as a teacher. And it's frustrating. It's really frustrating. And so what are we going to do? Well, if we want to continue having school board meetings where everybody shows up and yells and, that threatens school board members or gets arrested, or, if we want the federal government investigating people who are showing up and speaking loudly at these meetings, like, we can do all that, but it's an insane way to handle this decision. We don't need all of this to be done centrally. We don't need the central decision making to further alienate the teachers, to make it harder to adapt to our students. We just don't need it. Okay. If you want communities to calm down, to support their schools, and to feel good about the product that their students are receiving, then you need to put some of the decision-making power back into the individual schools. Give it to the principals, the department chairs, and the classroom teachers. If there's a problem, it's handled there. Only the biggest problems need to go beyond that level, right? Only the biggest problems are going to have to move on up the chain. But when almost all the decisions are being made higher up that hierarchy, then that's where all the complaints go to. And when you centralize the decisions, you centralize the complaints. And when all those complaints come together, we get these movements around things that in a lot of cases probably aren't that big a deal and get blown out of proportion, or they become, sort of easy talking points for political activists. And it might be good to manipulate an election. It might be good to motivate people to donate to a cause, but none of it's good for your kids' education. It's just not. So my advice is hire the best teachers you can and trust them to make more of these decisions, and let more of that decision-making power reside in the school building rather than in a central office or a school board. This has been the ClassCast podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. If you have any thoughts, concerns, questions, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out. You can find the ClassCast podcast streaming on all major streaming services, plus YouTube, and at classcastpodcast.com. You can also find me on Facebook at ClassCast Podcast, on Instagram at ClassCast Podcast, and on Twitter at ClassCast Pod. Thank you very much. Have a good day.